In episode 0, I told you that the next conversation was called Fractured Erasure. I've since renamed it because the more I sat with this material, the history, the systems, the actual record of what's existed, the more I realized that the real story isn't about what was broken. It's about what was already standing long before anyone arrived to break it. She was already there. That's the most honest title. And if this series is about anything, it's about honesty. Before I started asking different questions, before I allowed myself to go back and actually look, I held a specific picture of what African tradition around gender was supposed to look like. The man is the head of the home, solely responsible for all rules, all provisions, all decisions. Every material thing that affects the family flows through him. The woman is there to have the children, raise them, cook, manage the home, to be the support, emotional and physical, for the man. Domestic matters are hers. The rest is not her domain. That was the picture. And I didn't receive it as something foreign. It felt native. It felt inherited, like it had been handed to me along with everything else that made me who I am. What I didn't know then, and what I've spent real time sitting with since, is that the picture itself was also handed to someone, and before that, to someone else. And if you trace it far back enough, the hands that it originally came from were not African. That is what this episode is about. Not to erase where we came from, not to pretend African societies were without any structure or male authority. They weren't, and I'll speak to that honestly. But to ask the more specific, more uncomfortable question. The version of tradition we're currently defending, the one producing the gender war that we're currently losing, when exactly did it arrive, and who did it arrive with? Let me be precise about something, because this is where the conversation usually gets muddled. Patriarchy is not a Western invention in the sense that only Western people practiced it. Male-dominated social structures developed across many parts of the world, including Africa, as communities transitioned from nomadic ways of living into settled agricultural ones. When you stop moving and you start owning land, when wealth becomes something you can accumulate and pass on, the question of who controls that wealth and who inherits it becomes politically urgent. Patriarchy, in its origins, was largely an answer to that question. But here is what the history is also clear about. The most rigid, most institutionally complete, most legally enforced version of patriarchy, the one with written codes, with courts, with the apparatus of states behind it, that version has a specific origin point. Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, Syria, Kuwait. Thousands of years before European colonialism, this is where patriarchy stopped being a social tendency and became legal architecture. The Code of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE, gave men explicit rights over women's bodies, their properties, their movements. It classified women for the first time in legal history as something that could be owned. That system traveled. It moved through empires, through religion, through centuries of European law. By the time the British arrived on African shores, they had spent millennia refining it. It was the only model of social order that they knew. And it was the model they imposed, not as one among many, but as the natural order of civilization itself. Now, and this is the part that matters most for this conversation, African societies were not waiting in a vacuum for this to arrive. Indigenous patriarchies existed here too. In pastoralist societies like the Zulu and the Maasai, where wealth was tied to cattle and defense required military organization, men held central political and economic authority. That is real. That is documented, and I am not here to pretend otherwise. But there is a distinction, a critical one, between what that looked like and what colonialism installed in its place. Indigenous African patriarchy, even in its most male-centered forms, was negotiable. It was relational. It was communal. If a husband was abusive or a chief was tyrannical, they were mechanisms deeply embedded in the social fabric that women could activate. Collective action, spiritual authority, community sanction. The women were never without recourse because the community itself was structured to prevent absolute unchecked male power. What colonialism brought was something different. It brought bureaucratic patriarchy, cold, institutional, state-enforced, a system where women's rights were not protected by community practice but had to be written in a law book. And if they weren't written there, then they simply ceased to exist. That is the distinction. Not patriarchy versus no patriarchy. Negotiable versus absolute. Communal accountability versus legal erasure. And it is the colonial version, the absolute one, the bureaucratic one, the one backed by British guns and Roman Dutch law. That is the one that most of us today are calling African tradition. But I want to go further into that distinction because the argument that I'm making in this episode isn't just that colonialism replaced one type of patriarchy with a worse one. It is that in many parts of Africa, specifically in societies that gave us the most documented, most sophisticated political systems, the structure wasn't primarily patriarchal at all. It was dual. The woman wasn't below the man. She was beside him with her own court, her own cabinet, her own domain of absolute authority. And the entire society understood that without her, the whole thing was incomplete. I want to talk about two specific systems because these are not theories. These are historical institutions with names, with documented functions, with court records and oral histories that survived despite every effort to bury them. The first is the Ohemmaa system of Western Igbo people. In communities like Onitsha, Asaba, Osomari, along the Niger River in what is now known as southeastern Nigeria. In these communities, the society was co-ruled, not ruled by a king with a queen beside him as decoration. Co-ruled by two sovereign monarchs, the Obi, the king, and the Ohemmaa. The Ohemmaa was not the king's wife. She was not chosen because of who she was married to. She was selected independently by a council of elders based on her leadership, her wisdom, her spiritual standing. She had her own palace, her own royal regalia, her own formal cabinet of female chiefs called the Otu Odu, and her own court. And her jurisdiction was not domestic. It was economic. The marketplace, the absolute economic engine of Igbo society, was entirely her domain. She set the prices. She regulated trade law. She settled commercial disputes. She levied fines on anyone, male or female. If a man violated market rules, he answered to the Ohemmaa and not to the Obi. She was also the spiritual guardian of the community, the one who performed cleansing rituals when the land was defiled, ensuring the community's peace and the fertility of the land that they depended on. And critically, If the Obi or the male chiefs passed laws that negatively affected women or the marketplace, the Omu could mobilize the women's assembly to shut it down, to strike, to enact social sanctions until the men came back to the table. That is not subordination. That is a check on power so sophisticated that it took the British centuries to develop an equivalent, and they still haven't managed to make it work as cleanly. The second system is the Ohemmaa, the queen mother of the Asante Empire of what is now known as Ghana. The Asante are a matrilineal society. Royal bloodlines, inheritance, the right to rule, all of it traced through the mother's line, which meant that the Ohemmaa was not a ceremonial figure. She was constitutionally indispensable. When a king died, it was the Ohemmaa's exclusive right to nominate his successor, not suggest, nominate. She could put forward a candidate up to 3 times, and if the council of male elders disagreed with all 3 of her choices, the governance of the entire empire stalled until an agreement was reached. No king could sit on the golden stool until her explicit sanction. She sat beside the king in court. She co-signed treaties. She maintained her own parallel court, the final court of appeal for any citizen who felt that they had received an unjust ruling from the king's court. And she was the only person in her entire empire who held the constitutional right to publicly rebuke the king. Anyone else who criticized him could face severe punishment. She alone could look him in the face and tell him he was wrong, and he was required to hear it. Think about what that means. In an empire where the king was considered sacred, where ordinary citizens couldn't as much as publicly question him, there was one institutional voice with the sovereign authority to hold him accountable. A woman's voice, built into the Constitution. I want to spend some time on 1929 because this is the moment where everything I've described, the Omu, the Ohemmaa, the entire tradition of women's sovereign political authority collides with the colonial project in the most visible, most documented, most deliberately erased way. I had heard of the Aba women's riots before this series. I knew that it was an uprising of some kind by women in southeast of Nigeria against some form of colonial imposition. I did not know what the actual imposition was about. It wasn't a riot. I want to say that clearly. A riot is chaotic, spontaneous, leaderless. What happened in 1929 was a war, strategically planned, precisely executed, coordinated across thousands of kilometers using traditional communication networks, palm branches, passed from community to community as a sign of collective distress. Here is what triggered it. In 1929, the global economy had collapsed. The price of palm oil and palm kernels, the primary export commodities managed almost entirely by Igbo women, had fallen by more than half. And in that moment of economic vulnerability, the British government announced its intention to expand taxation, not just on men, on women, their livestock, their personal property. The economic sovereignty that the Women's Assembly had protected for generations was suddenly under attack. Over 10,000 women mobilized. They descended on British administrative centers using a traditional protest mechanism called sitting on a man, surrounding the offices and the compounds of those responsible, dancing, chanting war songs, wearing traditional dresses as a declaration of who they were and what they were defending. They dismantled colonial symbols, they burnt native courts, they cut telegraph wires to isolate British stations from one another. And their primary targets were not only the British. They went directly for the warrant chiefs, These were African men appointed by the British to act as their local proxies. They were given powers that no traditional governance structure had ever sanctioned. These were men who sold out their communities for colonial favor. Men who the rest of the community, men included, left completely unprotected when the women came for them. But here is something I didn't know until I went back into history. The men of those communities didn't fight against the women. They stepped back deliberately because in Igbo tradition, when the women declared war, when the women's assembly activated, men were culturally required to honor that and stand aside. They instead guarded the villages, they looked after the children, they watched. And the British, so desperate to explain to themselves how all this was happening, spent months after the war searching for the male instigators they were certain must be behind it. Because in their Victorian minds, women did not hold sovereign power. Women did not plan military operations. Women did not coordinate resistance across thousands of kilometers. The investigation found nothing because there was nothing to find. The men had nothing to do with it. The women organized it entirely themselves, using systems of collective authority that had been functioning long before any British administrator arrived. Over 50 women were killed when colonial troops opened fire on them. Over 50 more were wounded. The British ultimately dropped the market tax, and then they reduced the whole thing to 2 words. Aba riots. That is not careless record keeping. That is deliberate erasure. A riot is something that needs to be managed. A war is something that needs to be reckoned with. And the British had no interest in reckoning with what they actually encountered. I think about the naming and I feel something uncomfortable. Because how many of us, how many of my generation, my circles, people who know and care about African history, have repeated the word riots without questioning it? How many of us have unknowingly protected this British narrative simply by repeating the vocabulary they left behind? 1929 was not that long ago. 97 years? There are women who participated in that war whose grandchildren are alive today. That is how recently this happened, and also how far we have drifted from even knowing it. That is what erasure actually looks like. It's not always a book being burned. Sometimes it's just a word being changed. The women of Aba won in 1929. The tax was dropped, but the British didn't leave. And what they left behind, what they had been building the entire time, was a legal architecture that made the victory in the streets almost irrelevant. Before colonialism, a married African woman in much of the continent retained her own economic identity. What she earned in the market was hers. What she inherited through her lineage was hers. Her husband could not touch it. Colonial law changed that overnight. British common law in Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Roman Dutch law in South Africa, Namibia, Lesotho, both built on a legal concept called curvature. The doctrine that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was absorbed entirely into her husband's. She ceased, in the eyes of the law, to exist as an independent person. She could not own property in her name. She could not sign a contract. She could not open a bank account. She could not apply for a passport. All of it required her husband's written, notarized permission. If he died, the colonial courts did not recognize her customary rights to anything they had built together. The property instead went to the male line. That's what the law said. In one stroke, not through violence, but this time through ink, the woman who had been a market ruler, a kingmaker, a spiritual guardian, a co-sovereign, became a legal minor, placed in the same category as a child. And that legal architecture didn't leave when the colonizers did. It stayed, absorbed into the post-independent states, inherited by African governments who were themselves products of colonial education systems. It was reproduced through law schools and courts and family structures until it became, to us, just the way things are. Tradition. I want to speak to something personal here, briefly, because it's not the center of this story, but it's part of how I understand it. I grew up watching both of my parents work. My mother was at various points the primary breadwinner, at points the sole income earner, and my father accepted that without protest. That part felt balanced. But I also watched my father hold firmly to what he understood as his traditional role when it came to the home. Even when my mother was carrying the full financial weight, the domestic work remained hers. That double standard, the selective application of tradition when convenient, the exemption from that natural give and take when it was required of him, that was something I've had to sit with. It didn't feel right. It felt unsettling. A performance of traditional African manhood that, when I trace it, honestly has more in common with Victorian-era British family structure than anything our actual ancestors practiced. That is not an indictment on my father as a person. It is an observation about what happens when a system gets absorbed so deeply that it stops feeling like a system. It just feels like life. And that is exactly what we're dealing with at scale across African and diasporic communities today. The men defending hyper-patriarchal structures as African tradition, I want to ask them something directly. Not out of judgment, but to offer them the honest mirror I think they deserve. Does it sit right with you? At a soul level, at a root level, does the tradition you are defending feel true to the bone? Your own ancestors understood the power of the woman's voice, her spiritual knowledge, her economic authority, her divine role in the governance of the community. They didn't just tolerate her full expression, they quite literally required it. They understood that without it, something essential was missing. Whose patriarchy are you actually defending? Have you gone back far enough to check? Because I am willing to bet that at a deep enough level, it doesn't feel as familiar as you've been told that it should or as you would want it to. And to the hyper-feminist voices, those who have responded to the pain of this imported patriarchy with a version of resistance that sometimes echoes its hostility, I want to say this too. The African woman was a warrior, a kingmaker, the moral and spiritual compass of her community, the keeper of its lineage and its future. Sexual autonomy wouldn't have been a negotiation she even thought to have. She was the one the men around looked to for direction, for completion, for balance. She wasn't the religiously submissive woman that was reduced to the private space of the home. She was submissive to the progression of her community. That is a completely different thing. What this imported patriarchy did, and what it continues to do, is make enemies of two forces that were never designed to be in competition. It took the balance and turned it into a hierarchy. It took the complementarity and turned it into a contest of winners and losers. And now we're fighting each other inside a house that someone else built, using rules that someone else wrote, while the blueprints of something that actually worked gather dust in the archives. Both sides of this gender war are fighting distorted narratives. And those distortions have been passed down so consistently, absorbed so thoroughly, that most of us have stopped asking whether any of it is actually from us. African men and women who are lost in this battle, lost in a war that was historically orchestrated to destabilize their communities, are not failing each other. They are succeeding at exactly what the colonial project designed them to do. Continue the fracture. Sustain the imbalance. Keep fighting over the house. But we don't have to, because she was already there. She existed before they arrived. She held sovereign authority that the colonizers couldn't process and so refused to see. And the fact that most of us don't know her name, don't know the Omu, don't know the Ohemmaa, don't know that the women of Aba fought a war and not a riot, that is not an accident. Remembering is reclamation. And we need to go back and find us. This is the Afromanjaro Sessions, Stolen Frameworks. Episode 2 is called Cosmic Complementarity, and we are going into the philosophy, the way our ancestors actually enshrined gender, not as a rank, but as balance, two forces, two energies, and what it cost us when that understanding was replaced. I'll see you there.